For many founders, being able to sell to exit your company is the ultimate dream. But when you get there, how do you know what to do? How do you interact with the buyer? How do you make sure you're getting the most value that you deserve and you're not making any mistakes that are going to harm you? I talked to Lowell Ricklefs. He's the managing partner at Traction Advising, and he walked us through exactly what to do in that scenario. In fact, he advises sellers of B2B SaaS companies all the time, shares with them exactly how they can set up their companies for success when it comes to exiting. This is going to walk you through that. He gives us a great structure for how to do it. Enjoy.
Welcome to SaaS-Story in the Making, the podcast that features the people who made the software world what it is today and the leaders who are shaping the future of technology. Here's your host, Matt Wallach.
Yes, I am Matt Wallach. I am your host. This is SaaS-Story in the Making, and I am super excited to have you here and delighted to have my special guest, Lowell Ricklefs. Lowell, how you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Super excited to have you here as well. Let me tell everybody about you, Lowell. Lowell is the founder and managing partner at Traction Advising. It's a premier boutique M&A firm focused on B2B SaaS companies between 5 and 20 million ARR. Really what he does, he helps founders find the right acquirer and negotiate the best deal. That is extremely important. And I can tell you, when I was going through that myself with my companies, it's very valuable to have somebody like Lowell on your side. He's also the education committee chairman at Alliance of Angels and board and CEO advisor at EventCore. So he absolutely knows his stuff when it comes to SaaS companies and advising CEOs. So Lowell, once again, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, this is great.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, tell me, what's going on with you lately over at Traction Advising and what's coming up for you guys?
Probably the biggest thing is a year ago, we added a partner in London. One of my favorite employees. I had a 25-year operating career, and one of the employees that was near the top of the list of high quality, high integrity execs I'd worked with. So he joined. It gives us some broader reach. We closed the deal in June. That'll be released today. There should be an announcement. We can talk more about it. And closed the deal. And the employee wellness company bought an employee engagement company. So Tiny Pulse was bought by Limeade last month. Got a med tech company we're working on. We've got 2 more in the works. So it's busy out there, and we're having a lot of fun working with some good folks.
Sounds like a lot going on. A lot of irons in the fire for you.
That's true. Yeah.
Very, very cool. Well, a lot of our people listening to the show are founders and leaders in software companies, and they're growing, they're scaling. They feel like eventually there's going to be an exit. That's their goal. But can you give us an overview of what an M&A advisor means exactly, and how do you help buyers and sellers of businesses make a deal?
Sure. Part of it is it can be an expensive learning lesson to go it alone. I was on the buying side, was part of acquiring about a dozen companies, and we bought companies with the benefit of a broker on the other side, and we bought companies sometimes without it. And simple things like would ask for the cash on the balance sheet. If you don't have someone to say that that's not a part of the typical deal, we get the cash, and you may lose out on $1 million or a couple $1 million.
Wow.
But a lot of what we'll do is we'll help research the buyers. Typically, we'll find 2 to 5 to 10 times the potential buyers that someone that's been building the company thinks is out there. We will help put together their financials and then the messaging. I mean, part of what makes us different, we sell a company much like we would sell a technology product. So it's less about the traditional investment model where you collect a lot of information, you spam all of your contacts, see if there's interest, and then run a structured process. That wouldn't work very well in your business. I don't believe it works well for technology companies. So we spend a lot of time on the messaging. We put ourselves in the shoes of the buyer and try to understand, why would someone actually buy this company? Like, what would it do for their revenue growth, both short-term, long-term? What would the revenue look like at scale in a large organization? So we spend a lot of time understanding who the buyers are and then positioning the messaging. So both the SIP, the confidential information presentation, as well as the outreach message to make sure that it aligns with what a buyer is looking for. And then there are hundreds of little things that come up along the way as well. Some are personal. Do you want to stay with the company? Do you want to we negotiate your non-compete. It's awkward if you say I want to stick around, but then you're trying to say I want a really broad, I want a really narrow non-compete. It's easy for us to do that on their behalf. We could do the tough stuff so that the founder can remain, the good person. We can ask for the tough things, and they can be the classic good guy. We can negotiate for their compensation. We can negotiate for retention bonuses. So there are a lot of things that are in there. And when you've got a professional buyer, it's just unfair to not have a professional on your side to kind of match wits on the business side. On the contract side and the legal side, you want a good M&A advisor. So that's kind of at a high level. But a lot of it really is, there are hundreds of small, I'll call them judgment decisions, where we become an advisor. Lowell, what would you do here? What would you do there? And do you think I should share? Should I reach out here? They want to talk to our clients. Do you think we should at this point in the process? Well, it just depends. So yeah, we could talk a lot about that.
I mean, that's amazing. The fact that, the buyers are trying to get as much as they can. They might see an opportunity for somebody who maybe doesn't understand what they're doing. Like you said, asking for the cash on the balance sheet. That could be a ton of money that you just give up. You're like, okay, yeah, that's part of it, I guess. That's incredible. But I want to understand. So you were a buyer and now you kind of represent sellers. Which side do you like more? How do you see that whole, interaction playing out? What do you like?
Yeah, I became experienced in this, I would say almost accidentally, just in the course of running. Worked for Rockwell, Fortune 500 company, and then was COO of a publicly traded company, 120 million in revenue, and then I was a co-founder of a startup. Right, I mean, right down a napkin and trying to get our first dollars in the door. But so I really, until it came time to sell the company that would co-found it, I'd really never given any thought to a career in M&A. But I really just looked back on the experiences I'd had with buying companies, and the bankers that I'd worked with had a accounting and finance background. They didn't have a sales background. They weren't, and I just thought, with an enterprise selling background, I just thought we could position this company better than others. And it turns out we were successful. We ran the process for another company, and we realized there was an opportunity out there to represent founders. I do a lot of mentoring. It's like oxygen. It's like a drug, working with startups. And so I love to do it, and I do a lot of that actually globally, less so over COVID. But I enjoy the selling part. I work for the founders to try to help the founders and their investors. I mean, I understand what it's like to start a company. I know how hard it is. I know the sacrifices that you make. I know how much you appreciate the investors who wrote checks to you in the days when everyone was saying no, how important it is to get money back to them. So I love representing the sellers, and both at a personal and professional level. And that's why we're hands-on. That's why we don't scale into a larger organization. We're very selective about which CEOs that we work with. We walk them through arguably one of the most stressful processes they'll go through in their life. And so we're careful about who we go through that with. But having said that, you asked a good question, in that I do have a lot of experience on the buying side. So I know why companies buy. I know what the process looks like on the back end. I've sat in the meetings after the conversations with the seller, where HR asks questions, where the CTO asks questions, where the board asks questions. So I understand what it's like to manage all those expectations to kind of get it across the finish line. The other thing is, ironically, because I actually have more experience on the buying side than many of the companies that buy our sellers. So I clearly work for the seller, but often the buyer may have very little experience. They may have none. They may have bought one or two or three companies. And so often I'll earn the trust of the buyer. And again, even though I work for the seller, I'll provide advice on, I know you want to structure it this way because you think this makes sense, but a year into the deal, you may want, employee X, the CEO, you may realize he's really good at product development and you want to work on this new widget, but you've tied all of his compensation to the old widget and you're stuck because he's not going to want to work on that. He or she's not going to want to work on that. So I spend a lot of time almost like an arbitrator sometimes, negotiating things and trying to help each side, when the tensions run high, understand the other side. If the seller is saying they want to look at our code, they're a competitor, I'm not comfortable. And I said, I understand that. Let's put together a structure so that they can't see it in a way that they can use it against you, but also understand they're buying your IP. You wouldn't buy a company without looking at their IP either and spend all this money. And the same thing on the for example, on the buyer side, when they're saying, "Oh, I can't believe they don't want us to look at their code," and say, "Well, think about a big competitor buying you guys. You wouldn't want them to see your code either." And so usually they'll say, "Yeah, I guess there's something a lot." I spend a lot of time kind of reframing things when the tensions run high, so people can kind of find that they're at a gridlock of what each side wants and try to find that third way and a path forward.
It's almost like you're kind of playing mediator there. It seems like
it is.
Just making sure.
Yeah. That's exactly what it is. Yeah.
Very interesting. Well, what are buyers looking for when they see a potential acquisition company and they're saying, "Okay, this is something we want to pick up"? What are buyers particularly looking for? What do they like seeing?
Well, it depends if it's a strategic. Usually they'll know the domain that you're in, and they'll know pretty quickly. Is it they want? Are they looking for geographic expansion? We did that. I worked for a company in Europe, and we bought some U.S. companies and looked at some things in Asia Pacific. So you're looking for a footprint to become global. It might be a hole in your product line. We did a deal a couple of years ago where Smartsheet bought a company called 10,000 Feet, and 10,000 Feet was the best in class at a certain function. Smartsheet had built it, but it wasn't great, and so it filled a product line. And then they could roll it out to all of their to 100 times the volume of clients, so they could justify that at scale. Private equity buys platform companies. Private equity actually has $5.8 trillion in revenue in private equity right now, which, to put in perspective, that's about the GDP of Germany. So there's a tremendous amount of capital out there, and about 80% of that is deployed, and is deployed into companies that are real companies, that what we would call strategic. So many of the strategics that are buyers have PE backing, so they look a little bit like financial buyers. But the metrics they'll look at for SaaS companies in particular, they'll look at revenue. People want to know, what's my company worth? So less than $1 million, it's difficult to sell. It can be, but it's difficult. Once you hit 5 million, the 3, 4, 5 million, you've got some scale. The revenue might be meaningful to a lot of companies, and there's a real business there. Once you hit 10 million, you're big enough to be a platform. So people will buy you for the financial performance, as not just an add-on to an existing platform. So revenue is a big deal, and the multipliers. Not only does the numerator get larger, but the multiplier actually gets higher as well. They will look at profitability. Many people anecdotally will say profitability doesn't matter, and they'll point to an acquisition where a company had no profits. It doesn't always matter, but I will tell you the vast majority of the time it does matter. There are a lot of very good companies with very good growth, but they're burning 50 to 100% of what the revenue number is. Many strategic acquirers have covenants to their bank on their debt, and they can't take on that level. They don't want to hurt their own performance. So
interesting.
You don't have to be super profitable, but I would argue that at least being break even is important, because if you're not profitable, then the leap of faith that the acquirer has to take is that at scale, they won't just lose more, right? If I lose $1 million a year at 5 times that revenue, I lose 5 million. They know that it can be profitable. They look at growth. Growth is one of them. So the simplest thing, I'll list about 8 different things, but the 2 simplest would be growth and retention in SaaS. The reason people pay high multiples for SaaS companies is because it's repeatable revenue. If you've got high churn, it's not, at some point, it's not really SaaS. It's not really long-term revenue.
For sure.
If 100% churn in a year, all they're really doing is buying a 1-year license. So that's a big deal. So growth is a big deal. If it's declining, it can be difficult to sell. I've heard the expression, they don't want to catch a falling knife. If it's flat, that's okay. There are a lot of value buyers out there, or it may be a good product fit. If you're in the 0 to 20% range, I would say that's probably where the majority of companies fall. That's not a bad place to be, and there's interest. If you're in that 20 to 40%, they call it, the rule of 40. If your growth percentage plus your EBITDA percentage is 40 or higher, it makes you extremely attractive to some of the highest performing private equity firms that buy companies. So the rule of 40 is real, and they talk about it all the time. If you're in the 40 to 100% growth range, you're extremely attractive to most companies.
Well, as a sales coach, teaching founders how to make their companies be exponential, I love hearing that because we experienced that at my companies. We had some serious growth numbers, and we saw a lot of people coming our way wanting to be a part of it, wanting to acquire us, and that's kind of what we're doing, helping other companies get to that level to make sure that they're accelerating at a very fast pace. But I love that rule of 40. So if you can get to that and start seeing 40% plus, then it sounds like you're going to have a lot of suitors.
A lot of people. Yeah. I would. Yeah, that's your core business. If you can get people to 40% or higher, it puts them in a pretty elite category. And a lot of people will pay attention and will potentially pay the double-digit multiples for the companies.
Okay, beautiful. So kind of similar to that, how can software company leaders set up their businesses to look great to potential buyers? I mean, you mentioned the profitability. We used to try and run break even early to make sure we put everything back into the company to fuel growth. But is it one of these scenarios where as you start to get close to acquisition, you kind of pull it back and say, okay, let's make sure we show some profits for a while?
Well, it depends. I would say if you're burning heavily, look at one of the things I've seen is companies that are well capitalized often get very comfortable with the mindset of we burn cash. That's just who we are. And sometimes that money isn't necessarily being well spent. I mean, one way I always tell people look at it, like if this was your money, if you were spending this money, would you spend it on that? So the extent that you can minimize expenses that don't have a lot of short-term gain, I would focus on that. So you don't want to kill the future, but you don't want to spend a lot of money on things that won't show a return for 3 or 4 years, because that will hurt you in the short term. Also, I would look at some of the metrics. I mean, look at logo churn and net revenue retention are two of the metrics that buyers look very, very closely at. If you look at the publicly traded companies, they're usually very sophisticated about how they measure churn. When you're a startup, you'll take anyone and everyone. I mean, who cares? Sign up. If they leave, it doesn't matter. They paid for a while. You need the cash, right? You're hungry. But when you're selling a company, it does matter. So
absolutely, get
a little bit smarter about someone who's a trial. If they don't truly sign up for a recurring long-term subscription, I would argue you should work with your attorney to make sure you get it legally correct. But I would argue that that's not really a subscriber, so that shouldn't count against your churn number. So, or change the way that you onboard people so that they get a chance. Maybe they pay short-term monthly and it rolls into an annual contract, or there's a free trial. But those that bounce before they're long-term, kick them out. And then net revenue retention. I find pricing is all over the board, right? For most companies, there's not a lot of sophistication that's behind it, right? It's a little bit of we'll try this and see what people will pay for. And most companies are cautious about doing a price increase. But net revenue retention really measures how much your existing client base grows. A simple thing you can do is 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 10% price increase across the board bumps your net revenue retention metrics by 3, 4, 5, 7, 10%. And most clients, if they like your product, they won't balk at it. And if they do, you can also you can always back down individually with them. But clean financials. Make sure you're properly accounting for all of your expenses, all of your revenue, and then IP confidentiality agreements. I can't express enough how important it is. You're starting a company. It's 3 people in a kitchen, again, around a napkin. If someone's writing code for 3 months before you have a real company and they didn't sign an IP agreement when you're selling the company, I can almost guarantee they're going to find out, or you're going to have to disclose it. And if one of those 3 people left on less than friendly terms, and 8 years later you have to call them to get them to sign that because you've got a transaction, they now have leverage. It's an awkward situation. It's pretty common. So I encourage people. Just get it buttoned up now. Do it yourself, or have someone comb through. If they're missing, reach out when there's not a transaction pending, and get those things signed, or at least identify who's out there and what that risk is. So,
wow, that's pretty incredible. That you'd have to maybe go back and get that IP agreement. What other mistakes do software leaders make when they're trying to sell their businesses, Lowell?
It depends. I mean, one is if they try to go it alone. I think the biggest one I see, and I try to vet for this, is unrealistic expectations. I've talked to companies before where I talk to a lot of different companies at different stages, and they'll say, well, we'll do $1 million in revenue this year, and we're growing 10%. It's like, well, what would you value it at? And they'll say, well, I'd take 50 million. And I'm thinking, okay, I mean, maybe someone would pay that, but they're probably not. I mean, I talk to probably 1,000. I have 1,000 conversations a year with buyers. I know what these people will pay. So that's a bit unrealistic. I mean, you need to be a little bit dialed in, to reality in that part. The other thing is is clarity of all of your numbers. All the numbers that you share, they shouldn't change. So whether they're your financials, with your revenue, if it's your churn, if it's your profitability. Most small SaaS companies have cash financials. They don't do accrual. That's okay. The buyer is going to do what they call quality of earnings. So they'll create accrual finances. You don't want to find mistakes, because it's better to take the time up front to get it right than it is to roll it out and then later find problems in it. And then the other thing is just I encourage founders to just be yourself. Don't try to be a company. Don't try to be something that you're not. Just talk about who you are. We'll help position how it can look as a part of the broader thing, but don't exaggerate. Don't oversell. Be factual. Because some of that stuff can come back to bite you. It's one thing to talk about forward-looking, because no one knows what will happen in the future, but you want to be factual about where the business is today.
Yeah, that's super smart advice. What do you say to entrepreneurs who ask when it's a good time to sell their business? And they say, "Hey, when should I do it? Should I do it here? Should I do it here?" What do you tell them?
You know what? It's a good question, and there's no right or wrong answer. One of the things I try to find out is, why do you want to sell? Like, where are you right now? Are you burned out? Are you 7 years in? I talked to a lot of people that are in that 5 to 10 year range. They thought it'd be a $1 billion company. It's linear growth. It's not the hockey stick growth. And they know what the future looks like, and they don't want to do it anymore. And that's fine, but it's a B2B business. They have real clients. They solve real problems. That's what the majority of the companies that we work that they look like, which is fantastic. But it's like, what do you want to do with it? And what do you want for it? And what's your belief in the macro level economics? Because if you look in the mirror and you believe that next year your business will be double what it is this year, your company will probably be worth double if your revenue is double. So then ride it out. But if your honest conversation with yourself is, I don't know, and I have huge doubts. I've been at this for 10 years. I don't have any money. I've got kids that need to go to college. My personal balance sheet is low. I've got everything tied up in the value of this company. That's one reason you might want to sell. It doesn't have to be binary. It doesn't have to be cash out or stay in. Private equity will often want you to roll over 10 to 40%. So you can take 60%, say the company's worth 20 million. You could take 60% off the table. It's 12 million. You can roll over 40%. I would tell you, most of the people I work with that take a second bite at the apple make far more on the second exit than the first exit. PE comes in, they come in their professional resources and the capital, they may acquire some other companies. And then 5 years later, the company sells for 5 to 10 times the value, and they get enormous exits. So that's one way to hedge your bets. You can stay in, but you can take some money off the table. And then part of it really is, multiples are high right now, higher than they've ever been for companies. Now, I said that a year ago, and I said the same thing then. Will they be as high or higher next year? Well, they are. Now, I say the same thing. Will they be as high or higher next year? They could be, but at some point, when you're at an all-time high, you look at the stock market, right? You got record multiples on stocks. Is it likely to go up? I don't know. I'm not an expert on that, but there's a lot of risk in that. So it just depends on your own personal risk. Macroeconomics, right? I mean, the dot bomb in 2000, the financial crisis 2008. No one really saw those coming. Things were great, multiples were high. A week later, you couldn't give things away, right? So. How would you feel if that happened? So there's no right or wrong answer. Part is like teasing out people, like, what are your priorities? What are your interests? Or even my wife has this strategy. She called it her regrets theory. What would you regret more? Selling your company and finding out it was more valuable later, or not selling it and a year later the bottom falls out and you say, I should have sold it. Which of those scenarios which of those downsides can you live with the most? And often that helps people make the decision. They say, I can't live with that. I can live with this. And it's like, okay, then move forward.
That's amazing. Super fantastic advice. What other advice would you give to software leaders who are now just starting out? What can they do in the early stages to kind of prepare their company for a future acquisition?
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to build a business, right? It's hard to start it and raise money. But like I said, IP confidentiality, I would get that started right from the start. And that's pretty easy. Make sure your financials are in order from the start. And I would take some time to look at the industry and who you think the potential acquirers would be. And then through the normal course of business, try to meet those people. If you're at a conference, or if you want to send an email, try to get to know the CEO. You don't necessarily have to meet corp dev, but the CEO or VP of product, or try to make them a customer. Acquiring a company is a little bit like getting married, and it helps if you've been dating for a while first. So if they've been a client for 2 years, and I go in at the CEO or corp dev level to sell the company, and they can reach internally and say, what do you think of this company? And they say, this is fantastic. We've been working with these folks for years. That helps a lot. It helps to jumpstart the process. So I wouldn't spend an inordinate amount of time, but I would spend some time, if not weekly, on a monthly basis, thinking about who might acquire you and what kind of relationship would be desirable. It doesn't mean you should talk to them about, I'd like you to buy us one day, but it'd be good to do business with them. It'd be good to just be on the radar of who they are. Even if it's LinkedIn, the CEO, reach out and connect with them, send a short message. It's a tiny little plug, right? Like Inception, you can plant the seed of who they are. You're on their radar. You're not a complete stranger if I knock on their door and say, hey, we've got a great company that we think would be a good fit for you.
Super good advice. Just make sure you build your network early. Make sure you connect with the powers that be. I love it. Well, Lowell, this is fantastic. This was a lot of great information that you shared. I want to know, how shall our audience learn more about you? Where can they find you?
I try to, LinkedIn is kind of my go-to. So, just search kind of a unique name, Lowell Ricklefs on LinkedIn. So there's only one there. You can email me directly at lowell@tractionadvising.com, and then our website as well. You can learn more, www.tractionadvising.com.
Okay, perfect. And we'll put all of that into the show notes. If you're listening on the podcast, it's going to also be in the YouTube description if you're here watching. But Lowell, this was awesome. Thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thanks, Matt. This was fun. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. And thank you for watching. Thanks for listening. Make sure you're subscribing. Hit that button so you can subscribe and get notified about new episodes as they come out. You do not want to miss other creators and innovators like Lowell sharing their best tips and tricks for you. So thank you very much for coming, and we will see you next time. Take care.